Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lisa with Lisa Capen Quilts, and today, look what I have up on the wall. We're going to be finishing up our quilt top for Nighty Night, the t-shirt quilt, and in this series I've walked you from the very beginning up until today where we finish this t-shirt quilt top. In this series I'm giving you all of the measurements that you need to make the throw size. The pattern is available. There's a link down in the description box below if you want to make it another size. The pattern includes 4 sizes for this t-shirt quilt. So today I'm going to walk you through how to make the horizontal sashing, the little tiny pieced strips that go in between our rows, and then we're going to add the borders, which really in this quilt really aren't designed to add a lot of size to the quilt. However, they finish and frame our quilt very nicely. So we're going to walk through all of those steps in today's video, and let's go ahead and get started. To start today, let's go ahead and go over all of the things that you need to gather in order to assemble the horizontal sashing. We're making the throw size, so we will need 4 pieces of pieced sashing to do the horizontal pieces in between our rows. So for the horizontal sashing, we're going to need 5 different fabrics. Of course, you could change that up if you want to change the look of your quilt. You could use one solid piece of sashing as well. You don't have to piece all of these blocks together. You could use a long strip of sashing, a solid color if you wanted to. It's your quilt. In order to make the pieced sashing that shows in this pattern, we're going to use 5 different fabrics. I'm using scraps from my stash, and so I have just an assortment of scraps that I've pulled for this quilt. And if you're purchasing fabric for this quilt, it's about 1/4 yard for each one. Let's see, horizontal sashing. Nope, I'm sorry. It's 1/6 yard for each one of your 5 different colors. From these 5 different colors, you want to cut 18 2.5 by 2.5 inch square pieces from each color. Okay, so that's what we're going to do to get started with our horizontal sashing, is to go through and cut 18 pieces from each color. Let's start with this one here. And I'll cut out the first set of squares with you. We're going to measure over 2.5 inches. I'm going to measure over 2.5 inches. And because I'm not quite sure if that's going to be enough, let's go ahead and cut a 3rd strip. If anything, I'll have some extra little 2.5 inch squares that I could put back in my stash. And I'll have those ready if I ever need them for a project. Let's go ahead and scoot these around and cut them from the other direction. Just going to line them up right on my mat, nice and straight. Just like that. And now we can cut 2.5 inches from this direction as well. Careful not to shift anything around. So there's 2, 4, 6. There's 12. And there's the 18 for my quilt. So I'm going to do this process through the other 4 remaining fabrics. And once I'm done, we're going to meet at the sewing machine with all of our pieces because we will be doing some chain piecing, and that will speed up the process of piecing our 4 sashing strips. Of course, if you're making one of the other sizes in this pattern, you're going to need more pieces, and you might need more strips to join your rows. So make sure you follow the requirements for the size that you're making. I'm going to go cut my other little squares, and we'll meet at the sewing machine. Now, before I head over to the sewing machine, because I want my sashing pieces to go in a particular order, I'm going to take all of my cut 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares and lay them out in a particular order. You can do this, or you can just make it scrappy and all mixed up. It's totally up to you. It's your quilt. I'm going to go through and organize my 4 pieces of sashing with all of my tiny little pieces. Now here we are with our 4 rows of needed sashing. All of my pieces are laid out, and one thing I wanted to note about the piece count for the sashing is depending on how you lay out your pieces is how many pieces you need. Okay, so you'll see I have 2 complete rows of 22 pieces, and because of the way I want to lay my pieces out, I actually need 2 more black pieces and 2 more polka dot pieces to finish these 2 rows because of the way that I laid them out. And I actually ended up with extras of the other colors. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 20 pieces of the black instead of 18, and 20 pieces of the polka dot instead of 18. And these will just be extras in my stash. So I need 2 more of each one of those colors. If you were just cutting out random pieces and doing a scrappy pieced sashing, you would still have like 2 of these left over. And you wouldn't have to cut extras of any of the colors. But because I want to lay mine out in a specific pattern, I will need actually 20 instead of 18. So keep that in mind and maybe count out your pieces when you're cutting them, and see if you don't need to adjust the number on the pattern. So this will complete these 2 rows, giving me 22 pieces in each row. And now I am ready to take this to the sewing machine. We're going to chain piece all of these rows together, and all of these extra 2.5 inch squares will go into my stash. Coming to the sewing machine, you see I have my 4 stacks of sashing pieces. They're all in order, ranging from left to right. This is the very left fabric, and it goes in order all the way over to the right side, which this is the 22nd piece, the piece that's all the way on the right side of the quilt. I'm going to go ahead and just set these on my table right here. We're going to start chain piecing. Make sure you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance if you need to check that. Sew 3 pieces of fabrics together and measure your middle fabric. Check to see how accurate your 1/4 inch seam allowance is. You might need to sew your pieces together with a scant 1/4 inch, depending on the thickness of the thread you're using for your piecing. So keep that in mind. I've already checked my seam allowance. We're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and start by pulling in from my first stack the first 2 fabrics. We're going to put those right sides together and sew those with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now from my second stack, I'll pull up the first 2 fabrics. Sew those together. my third stack of fabric. And my fourth stack of pieces. Now we can take that off. Now we'll have a chain of 4 sets. This chain is going to grow longer and longer as we add all of the pieces. So let's go up to this top one. We'll open that up. We're going to bring in the third fabric and add that. We'll open up the second set, and from my second pile, bring in the third fabric, and this is it. This is us chain piecing all of these sections all at one time at the sewing machine. So I'm just going to record a part of this process so you can see it being done. And if you're like me, you've set all of your fabrics in a particular order, then this is going to help keep that order, but also save time because we can sew everything together at one sitting at the sewing machine. Once you're done piecing all of your pieces for your sashing, you're going to bring that over to the pressing board. You'll see here, all of my pieces, all of my rows are still connected by the threads. You could press it all just like this while they're still connected. I like to just go ahead. You have to separate them anyway. I find it a little bit easier to just go ahead and separate and cut all of the connecting threads, separate my rows, and then press. I'm going to press all of my seams in one direction, which makes this really quick and easy. There's my sashing piece, and I will press, separate, and press all of the rest of the sashing. Once you do that, we're going to add the sashing in between our rows. So you'll see my rows up on the board. We're going to add the sashing to the bottom of row 1, to the bottom of row 2, the bottom of row 3, and the bottom of row 4. To do that, I like to use a little bit of Elmer's glue. You could pin your sashing pieces in place if you want to. Just going to add a few dots of glue, match up my seams, match up my sashing right into place, and I will dry the glue with a good hot iron and a little bit of steam just to speed up the process. This glue will be dry when we bring this over to the sewing machine, and the glue is in the seam allowance. And so because of that, and because the glue is dry, you don't have to worry about it messing up or gumming up your sewing machine needle. And everything will stay right in place and make the sewing of our seam very easy. Now we can bring over our first row with our sashing piece and sew that from one side to the other with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sewing right along, making sure all of those seams stay nice and flat. Try to keep your seam as straight as possible. And you'll repeat this process for each one of your rows. Once you have your sashing piece connected to your row, you'll go ahead and press that open. Depending on your logo, if it's really close to the seam, you might want to cover your logo with a pressing cloth, just an extra scrap piece of fabric that will protect your logo from the heat of the iron. I'm going to go through and press my seam nice and flat. I'm pressing my seam towards the sashing. All the way from one side of the quilt to the other. And again, you'll repeat this process for each one of the rows that you are adding the sashing piece to. Once you have the sashing piece added to each one of your rows, then you can connect your rows together. So here's my very top row. Again, I'm going to use the Elmer's glue. You could pin baste if you want to. Just adding a few dots of glue, just enough to hold these pieces right into place. I'll bring in my next row, line up all of those seams, and dry the glue with a good hot iron. This is how you will connect each one of your rows throughout your quilt top. If you are making the throw size, then you'll have 5 rows. If you are making a different size quilt, you might have more rows than that. Once the glue is nice and dry, we'll bring this over to the sewing machine and sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All the way from one side to the other. Make sure those seams stay nice and flat. Once you're done with this seam, we can go ahead and press this over at the pressing board. This time I'm going to work from the back because I do have a pellon on the back side of my t-shirts. I'm going to go ahead and cover up my seam with a pressing cloth and then press that seam with a good amount of steam and make sure that it's nice and flat. You'll do this process each time you add one of your rows. I just find that it's easier to press those seams as I add a new row. And guess what? It is as easy as this. You'll add each one of your rows to complete your quilt top. Let's take a look at how this will look. I think that's pretty awesome. Now, once all of your sashing pieces have been added and your rows are connected, let's take a look at how this looks. So up on the board is my quilt top, the body of my quilt with the sashing pieces added. Now that the body of our quilt is all assembled, we have one last step to finish off the top of our t-shirt quilt. We're going to add a small 2.5-inch border, just like a little frame to really just finish off this top. So for the border fabric, you're going to need 1/2 yard of fabric. You're going to cut 6 strips that are 2.5 inches wide. I'm using some leftover quilt back, and so I only had to cut 4 strips because these were very long strips. But if you're using yardage, you'll need 1/2 yard. Cut 6 strips at 2.5 inches wide. Once you have your 6 strips, you're going to take them to the sewing machine and you're going to join all of them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press those seams open, and then you'll have one long, continuous, long piece of border fabric. We're going to first start by adding our border to the left and right of our quilt top. We'll press those seams, and then we'll add the border to the top and bottom, and guess what? This t-shirt quilt top will be finished. So let me go ahead and sit at my sewing machine. You've seen me piece together border fabric before in my videos, so if you are completely new, make sure to check out some of my t-shirt quilt videos and other videos on my channel, and I will walk you through that process. Let me go ahead and sew this together, press it, and we'll meet at the sewing machine as I sew the borders onto this quilt top. Now that our quilt top is all assembled, let's go over the things that you'll need to gather to finish this quilt. We'll need a quilt batting. Our quilt top measures 48 by 72 inches for the throw size. So you need a batting that is at least 3 inches bigger all the way on all 4 sides. We'll trim that up once the quilt is quilted. And guess what? For my quilt, I'm not going to use a batting. I think I'm going to finish this with a minky back. It's going to be very drapable and soft and cuddly. But if you want to add a batting to your quilt, it needs to be bigger than 48 by 72. For the backing fabric, you're going to need 4.5 yards to use as the back. You can use a cotton, you can use a fleece, you could use a flannel. I'm going to use some minky, and I think that'll give my clients a really great example of how a quilt finishes with a minky back without a batting. So that should be fun to show you how that turns out. And then the binding, you're going to need 1/2 yard. You're going to cut 7 strips at 2.5 inches wide, and that will be your binding material. So 1/2 yard for that, 4.5 yards for your backing, and a batting that is larger than 48 by 72. Now, here's the thing when it comes to quilting. We're all going to quilt our quilts differently. A lot of the times you see quilt patterns that walk you through the instructions on how to assemble the top, and then the pattern says quilt as desired. For all of us, that means something totally different. You could assemble this quilt as a quilt as you go, meaning once all of this is assembled, your quilt is already quilted. If you haven't ever looked into that and you're working with a sewing machine with a smaller throat space and you're concerned about actually quilting your quilt once the top is assembled, maybe looking into the quilt as you go method might be a really good option for you to finish larger quilts. Some of you are going to tie your quilt. That's a really great idea. Some of you could stitch in the ditch around all of your pieces and find a batting that is okay with a larger empty space and stitch in the ditch around your blocks. Many of you use your walking foot and stitch through like little X's through your t-shirts. That's an excellent idea too. I'm going to quilt mine on my long arm. I'm actually getting a computer for my long arm on Monday. Harlan surprised me and already ordered the computer system. So we're going to be picking that up this weekend. So I'm going to wait on quilting this quilt. I'll bring you along for part of that process next week as we get it set up and I learn how to use it. But since I have this quilt top, I'm going to go ahead and try to learn how to use this computer on the long arm with my quilt top. So yes, there's so many different options. And when you see quilt as desired, I don't want that to be overwhelming, especially if you're really new. My big suggestion would be to check out quilt as you go methods. There's so many different ways to do that. Unfortunately, I don't have any videos that show you how to do that because I've never done it. But I've watched tons and tons of videos, and there's so many helpful content creators, quilters out there showing the process. So make sure to check out their videos, and maybe that could be a really good option for you to get your quilt quilted, quilting as you go. Okay, I think we're off. I cannot wait to start seeing your pictures. I've seen one picture on the Creative Crew group. Their quilt is looking really awesome. They used purple and yellow. Okay, I hope you have a fantastic day. If you have any questions, make sure to jump down to the comments section. I'd love to hear from you. Until I see you next week, as we finish up this quilt, I hope you have fun creating. Bye, everybody.